Okay, so here we go. So today, as the slide says, we're going to be talking about user feedback, how to use it, how to work with it. So to begin, I want to just give a brief overview of what we're going to be talking about. So basically, user research is broken down into 4 different sections. They are usability testing, interviews, surveys, and then anything else you need to gather information about how your design is functioning. So each are important in getting a holistic view of your nonprofit for different reasons. In addition, you are going to be conducting all of these different things and different measures throughout the design process at different points in time. So that's just a very brief overview. I'll dive into these a bit more. But yeah, here we go. So the first one that I want to talk about is interviewing. So the basis of an interview with your nonprofit is different than other types of testing that you're going to do. So an interview basically determines how useful something is, and it isn't actually related to the design itself that you've created. It's something where you are generally facing the nonprofit representative that you're talking to, face to face. For us, it's going to be over Zoom. And these questions should be asked in kind of like a personal setting between yourself and the nonprofit. And so all of these questions will be open-ended, but they all pertain to the use of the design. And you can refer to your design itself when asking questions, but the design isn't always necessary when you're conducting an interview in this setting. In addition, it isn't necessarily about the design itself. It does not include questions about the design's ease of use or if the design is easy or difficult to manage. It's actually asking whether the user will use the design that you've created. And so for our case, it's basically asking the nonprofit if they are going to use the design that you've created. So that's the basis of an interview. And I will go over this in relation to usability testing as well, because you also will be doing that. But I do want to go over some example interview questions that will probably come up as you're working with your design and developing your design further. So there are many different types of questions that you can conduct. There are open discovery questions, which are basically just like, tell me about this. What or why about this particular thing? And these are kind of just open-ended questions. And then going further, it's questions about the user's tasks and activities, describe how, something is done. Perform or show questions, which is where you're asking your nonprofit, show me how you do something. Recalling a past situation or anticipating the future is a question like, recall a situation where this happened and what did you do to address that situation? And how do you think that X is going to help you? So basically all of these questions, in addition, there's also the opinions and point of view questions, as well as the problems and pain points. What do you think about this? What do you like about this? And how does this problem impact you? What are, a lot of these tie back to what we've already kind of done. And a lot of you did send me questions like these, which I really appreciated in those emails from last week. But this is more once you've already created your design and you're thinking about how it's going to be used by the nonprofit. So keep these in mind, because just because you've already asked me these questions does not mean that you're going to need to you need to keep asking more questions as you actually develop your design as well. And so then I also wanted to go over just a few questions if your nonprofit representative is maybe not giving you exactly what you want to hear in terms of like questions that you're asking and responses. So, all of these are pretty good examples of how you can kind of force them to answer your question further. You bounce back. Can you tell me more? What do you mean by this? These kinds of questions. Explain further, like why this is why this? How come? What's the reason for this? And then clarification. Obviously, that's just something like, what do you mean by this? Rephrasing is kind of taking what the nonprofit has said and saying something like, so are you saying that this? Just to further clarify any confusion so that you can produce the best product possible for your nonprofit. Recalling past experience, that's another good one. Where it's like, can you give me an example of something? Can you give me an example of this? Can you show me how you did this? And then the last question that I always recommend that you ask is just, is there anything else, anything that you want to add, anything else specific that you want to talk about? So when you are conducting these interviews, I want you to keep in mind that these ones are probably going to be balanced fairly closely with how many usability testings you're doing. But these are more to clarify the use of the design, not necessarily how your design was actually implemented. And these should be separate from what you're actually, from your usability test, which I'll talk about, I believe, next. Let's see. Yeah. So now I'm going to be talking about usability testing. So what is a usability test, why would we even use one? So the basis behind a usability test is to uncover problems in the design, discover places where the design can be improved, and to learn about the user. So these are pretty important key concepts that you will keep coming back to as you develop your design further. And to kind of go off of that, within usability testing, there are 3 different kind of groups and things that you need to consider as you kind of begin to develop and try to design your usability tests. So the first one is the facilitator, which will be you. So you're basically the guide for the process, and you're not necessarily asking questions, but you're explaining certain aspects of the design. But also you want to kind of take a step back when you're conducting these usability tests. You want to give the user, give your nonprofit or whoever you're doing the usability tests with, you want to give them your design and say, use it, basically. You want to make sure that they actually understand what you've created without you having to tell them what you've created. So that's one of the pretty important parts of a usability test. The next is the tasks, which is the activities that the user will actually do. And so this includes, using certain aspects of the design, such as like a button or a link, all of these kinds of things, and seeing if the overall design and layout makes sense to them. And that should be planned ahead of time. So yeah, definitely consider that when you're talking to your nonprofit partners and planning what your usability test is actually going to look like. And then the last, of course, is the participant. This may be the nonprofit representative, or if maybe you're lucky, you might be able to actually, if you may be designing like a volunteer tracking system, you may actually get to work with a volunteer to kind of test your design at its whatever state it's in. And so these are kind of the 3 core areas and core groups that you're going to need to be considering as you design your usability test, which is extremely important. And so then for general tests, or for general usability testing design, you do need to start kind of with these 7 steps. These are pretty vague, but I think I'll just probably start explaining these. So the first thing to do is actually plan the test, and a lot of this does depend on how far you've come in your design, because maybe you just want to test one page. That's totally fine. See if it's like the right pace or the right design that you want to actually work with. And then the next step is actually recruiting participants, which is definitely going to be through your nonprofit partner. You need to, reach out to them through email, kind of like we've done before, to begin to design these usability tests. And then, you need to prepare your materials, obviously. You need to have a planned idea of what's actually going to happen in the usability test, what guides and what kind of hints you're actually going to tell your user, while also maintaining that ability for them to actually explore your design and see if it makes sense for them. And then setting up the environment. This is going to be over Zoom. Kind of, we've touched on this a few times, I believe, but just make sure they know how to use Zoom, know how to access a Figma link, all of those things you need to make sure you've addressed. And then you actually need to conduct the test. Take a lot of notes as a usability test is actually happening. Take notes of what questions they ask as they're using the design. Take notes of what they say they don't like. Take notes of what they say they do like. All of these things are extremely important and will help you develop your design further. And then again, taking that, you need to analyze what you've learned, build upon that, maybe expand the parts of the design that they liked, maybe take away all the stuff that they were like confused about and didn't necessarily enjoy, because that back and forth between actually further developing your design will produce the best product possible. And then obviously reporting results, that's kind of reporting to your team, reporting to your PM, as well as your tech lead based on what the user has actually said. And so moving further into the usability testing. So an overview of what it actually is to figure out if you have ease of use. Is the solution that you have designed, does it actually make sense? Is it clear? Does it like warrant a good product that they are able to use? Efficiency obviously is that kind of breaking down your design into if it actually is easy to get from one place to another within your design. And you should be kind of taking notes on that as you go through your product as well with your user. And then the user friendliness, that is pretty much where you gauge if your design makes sense for the people who are actually going to be using it. And, you know, questions like when a user has trouble, is there real-time help that you can provide? The answer to that, it kind of depends, you know. You may have to, in your design, implement something that addresses the issue, you know, maybe like a help menu or a help bar. All of these different things you can probably consider as you're further developing and critiquing your own design and getting feedback from others as well. And so to further just kind of hit it home with usability testing. So this is determining how usable something is. It is insight into the design choices and not necessarily if a designer would use the design, which is where it kind of differs with the interviews that I was talking about earlier. So the researcher watches the user interact with the current design and lets the user think out loud, and it basically focuses on if the design makes sense or not. And so that is basically all I wanted to talk about with user testing. But one thing I also wanted to touch on was surveys. So surveys are something that I think will be extremely helpful, especially in our virtual format. This is basically a way to ask specific questions about certain user features. And it can be a lot faster than actually having to set up a Zoom meeting and go through this whole process. So I highly recommend taking advantage of surveys in one way or another. So they're pretty easy to make with just Google Forms. Then you can just send that to your nonprofit. Maybe if you want insight into maybe a color scheme that you've picked or the design of a button that you've created with Figma. You know, all of these things can be addressed fairly quickly through a survey, or, you know, even if you want to go even simpler, you can shoot them an email with a screenshot, whatever works best for you. But if you have like a compiled list of questions, definitely addressing those specific features will be very easy to do over Google Sheets or Google Form or something like that. And so you should also be conducting these throughout the design process just to get feedback and likely get it faster than having to set up an entire meeting. But you cannot rely only on your surveys to indicate whether your design is effective or not, because you do have to have your user interacting with what you've created. And so moving forward, I did want to talk once about design critiques. And so this is the last thing I wanted to talk about. So I would highly suggest that you plan maybe every week or two as you're going through your designs to set up a design critique. And that is basically where you ask people to tell you what is good and what is bad about your design. And so setting up these feedback pipelines are very important. And so what I think, what I'm going to do in the next couple of weeks is, as you guys start designing, I'm going to create a Slack channel where basically you can just send your Figma link. All of the directors will be on it. We'll be able to give you feedback. Maybe not in the next couple of weeks, maybe when you start designing, that'll actually probably be a lot better. But as you start designing, just getting feedback on what you can improve, all of these different kind of just input on what you've created, because all of that is going to be super helpful, especially with the developers and figuring out the front end. All of that is going to be super, super helpful. And I also want you to, you know, critique each other. You all have the best design eyes possible. So I highly recommend that you look at other people's designs, because likely that's going to give you feedback as well. And, you know, maybe even ideas for what you can implement in your design, because all these things will be super easy. And I do want the designers to be collaborating with each other because that'll be, yeah, that I think that will probably produce really cool designs as well. And so um, this was kind of a shorter presentation. I did want to talk about your task for this week, for Thursday. And I also wanted to go a bit over what you've created so far. And I did want to show you the Figmas that you all created, because they were, I saw them. Some of the other designers sent me them, and they're super cool. So we can talk about them a bit, give some critiques for Thursday. So just continuing on for Thursday, I want you to, based on our user feedback, begin designing high fidelity iterations for our bootcamp problem. And again, these do not need to be perfect. It is totally fine. I totally understand that we've only started this project maybe a week ago. So don't expect, I do not expect perfection. I just want you all to get kind of used to the Figma interface, as well as just, get some feedback so you can begin to learn how to, approach implementing feedback as well. And so with that, I believe one thing I am going to do, I'm going to send the Figma links from all of our designers in the design Slack channel, so then we can all kind of look at each other's, create those comments and critique, which is a cool feature of Figma. So I will definitely be sending those later tonight. And so then on Thursday, we will continue design critiques on the high fidelity designs, and more, and I'll just be giving you more information about the design process as well. So that pretty much concludes my presentation.